My name is Vijay. I've been doing meetups in Southern California for a long time.
Yep.
Like post-pandemic, I think every one of us like transitioned to like online and just learning how to use all these different tools. So today in the iteration of my meetup group or whatever, like it's all online, Zoom focused. There
Okay.
is a in-person aspect to it still. Just in general, I feel like having online makes it a lot easier to connect with people,
Sure.
especially across the nation. So like we've had meetups about different JavaScript topics in the past, especially React and a lot of the frameworks I'm sure you're aware of. Something our group wants to do and continue to do is just stay on top of what is important, what is relevant, especially for now. And I think that's even more important this year. And in the previous year too, you've seen like a lot of like change in the economy, jobs being displaced a little bit, and people wondering like what skills are going to get them hired in 2025 and going onwards, right? Like the
Right.
interview process is a little harder. And that's like what this is about, is just reaching out, connecting. You're a senior dev, I'm a senior dev, and just like trading information, seeing what can we share today, what can we mind share. That's all.
Sure. Cool. Nice to meet you. My name is Carson Gross. I teach at the University of Montana, or I teach at Montana State University. They would kill me if I said it. Anyways, I teach at Montana State Computer Science, and I'm a longtime computer programmer. I was actually in California, Northern California is where I was born and raised, and I moved out here about 6 years ago now. And I probably, if your people at Hackbuddy have ever heard of me, it's probably because of HTMX,
Right.
which is an open source library that I work on. And I've got some other open source work that I do as well, but that's definitely the one that's probably the most known and probably the most relevant to your people. I'm happy to talk about that and give my thoughts on what that means, like as far as careers go and what the future of the web holds and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good segue into what we could talk about. I think before we start with HTMX, I just wanted to get like more of your take on, I guess, like where the industry is going and like what do you see as the most useful skills to know today? Do you feel like
Yeah.
it's still like you need to be like to be a full stack developer or a front end developer? What would you say is like important for the interview or the resume?
I haven't been out in the muck lately. I can only say what I see online and what I hear from my students, which is it's a pretty tough job market right now. And so finding a new job is tough. So it's probably typically these things go in cycles. It's been
Yeah.
the end of development now about 5 or 6 times in my career where no one's going to be a developer anymore.
Yeah.
I'm old enough that it was outsourcing in the like early 90s, and we've been through all this. Now it's AI. I think computers are still going to be relevant. Obviously, technical skills are useful. I think if you have an existing job, it's probably not a great time to be a squeaky wheel. I
Yeah.
know that I was definitely a squeaky wheel in my career, and I look back on that and I probably caused myself some unnecessary pain. But you have to be your own self. One
Yeah.
thing I tell my students quite a bit is that I think, and this is my piece of advice to my students in general, is that I think technical skills are great, but I don't think it's always the best thing to compete only on technical skills. And so I would encourage people watching this to think about what else they know beyond technical skills, because I think one of the most powerful things that I've seen in my life is when someone understands a particular business really well and they have technical skills. So if you're in finance, take the time to understand how the finance actually works.
Right.
Go on, hang out with the traders, trying to understand what they're actually doing instead of being a pure technician. And I think that makes you much more valuable.
Right.
Technology is a force multiplier. And so if you can I often ask my students, what do your parents do? Does your dad own, if your dad's a contractor, do you know the contracting business really well?
Yeah.
Can you build software for him that's useful to him? And this is Montana, so there's a lot of ag and stuff like that here. But I remember I had one student he had an uncle who was high up at Costco, and I'm like, dude, he's worrying about to get a job. And I was like, Costco. And he's like, I'm not going to work at Costco. I'm like, there's programming at Costco. Like you can find it at these companies. And so I think this is probably one of those times when if you have, first things first, it's probably better to not be trying to find a job like right now. But if you are finding a job right now, having another skill or displaying interest in a business that goes beyond just like the technical stuff, I think is a good idea. Probably obviously, specializing in AI has been very successful over the last 2 years. We'll see if that holds up. These things tend to come and go a little bit, but I think being a full stack developer is always a good idea. HTMX, not to change subjects, but HTMX is geared towards full stack development, and there's something pretty powerful about being able to own an entire feature. Like you don't have to wait on the back end guys to do something before, if you're a front end person, or if you're a back end person, you don't have to wait for the front end people to tell you what they need. Being able to own a feature can be very powerful. So
very nice. I think I would 100% agree with like the advice you just gave. I think having like domain knowledge or like maybe like expressing a desire for the domain that you would like to work in probably will set you apart from just saying you're a tech person, especially if you are. I think there's, a lot of different people who might watch this, and I'm just speaking to like in general, like if you fit that mold. But there are people who will clone a React app and then say like they're a software developer. And then there are people who go to a true school, computer science school, and they complete the whole software engineering track. And then there are other people who, so like those people have like front end and back end skill. And then you have like just people who are like grinding leak code or something like that to get by. So I feel like in all three cases, right, like the domain knowledge stuff can help a lot more because you have competition at like almost every like level, right? Like if you're just copying like a React app and you're building that, you're gonna have a lot of competition. There's a lot of software engineers in college, you're gonna have a lot of competition. And then like there are people grinding leak code or whatever, you're gonna have a lot of competition. So whenever you have a lot of competition, it's just really hard in general.
Yeah, I think you see that like in game dev. Like it's such a passion-driven thing, and you just end up with so many people who are so smart that are grinding on it so hard, and so it makes it just hard to compete.
Yeah.
Even if you win there, how many companies have just like bloomed and then gone out of business because they they just can't keep the pace up.
Yeah.
I say it's just being a computer scientist these days, or a programmer or whatever, it's a thing. It's still a viable career. But on the other hand, knowing a business, like being a brewer who knows how computer programming works or whatever, is like that's a huge advantage over the other brewers.
Exactly.
So if you can pick a business like that and be that plus programming, then you're probably in a much better spot than any of your competitors are, versus trying to compete against the best of the best to get a job at Amazon or whatever.
Exactly. All right, so with that said, I think you said HTMX a couple times, so I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that as well. I think I am interested in this. I was just watching some of the YouTube videos about HTMX and how you transitioned from React over to trying HTMX and how it was just way better and like faster. So why is that, and what is the hype about HTMX?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's better. It's a different way of building web apps. It's better for some things and it's worse for other things. Because I think realistically, as a senior engineer, there's no absolute. There's just no absolutes here. HTMX is a front end library, I should say, it's oriented towards HTML. So rather than writing a lot of JavaScript to update your UI, instead you put annotations. You basically put attributes on HTML elements. And basically the four things it lets you do is put attributes on elements so that any element can issue a request based on any element, on any event. So not just click or whatever, but also if something's revealed in the viewport, or if a keystroke, like if a key up event occurs or whatever. And then it'll issue a request, and then it gets back HTML. So it doesn't communicate via JSON like most Reacts would do. Instead, it communicates via HTML. So you get HTML back from the server, and then it'll insert that HTML somewhere in the DOM.
I see.
And that probably sounds pretty simple. and it is a pretty simple idea, but you can actually do some pretty sophisticated stuff with it. They're within the constraints that are imposed on you by the system. So you can do things, for example, like autocomplete or active search is what I call it. And you're probably familiar with this from Google, where you go and you start typing, what you're searching for, and the results pop up as you type.
Right.
And so that's a pretty dynamic experience, certainly compared to the olden days of web applications. And that's something that's very easy to achieve with HTMX with only a couple of attributes. And then obviously you have to implement the search on the back end. So it takes web development, I don't want to say back to its roots, but it moves it. The way HTMX works is via what is called hypermedia.
Yeah.
It uses HTML exchanges with the server. Okay. And again, that's different than most React and Vue and all the rest of them apps that are built today, which use JSON. That's a data form. That's a data format, whereas it's not hypermedia. It's not HTML. And so it really leans into the hypermedia sort of ideas of the web, and just makes one thing I say about it is it makes HTML more powerful as a hypermedia. You can do more. You can build more dynamic UIs with HTML. So that's the big idea with HTMX. As far as some people have had a lot of success with it. Probably the most famous one was this company called Context in Paris, or in Paris. I think they're in Paris, France, but they're in France anyways. And they ported from React to HTMX, and they reduced their code base size by 2/3. So it went from 20 some odd thousand down to 7,000 lines of code. And the time to interactive went from 2 seconds down to half a second, or something like on the order of twice as fast. And that obviously makes HTMX look really good, and it was really good for their problem. And so I think it was a good choice for their problem, because they're a news site. They had a lot of like text and images and dynamic search and so forth. And so that's the wheelhouse for what HTMX is good at. I think it would be just some examples. I think HTMX would be very good for building like an e-commerce website. It's mostly text and images and search and a couple of other things. So you don't need all the fanciness of React for that kind of situation.
So I have some questions for you, right? I think, so number one, first off, just as a comment, that was the video that I was watching, the one by Context in France, where they were talking about how they switched over from React to HTMX. I guess, was the idea born from like a Django stack? Was that like the thing? Like, is it because React and Django don't really play that well, or is it? I've seen cases where
I can't say. I wasn't involved in the project. I don't know how. I think Django does a pretty good job of presenting a JSON API. It sounds to me like the React developer that was there was just having trouble keeping everything going. And React does. So when you do when you choose a reactive tool, you are introducing another layer of data. And so you've got this front end, and it's separate, and it's got its own state that has to be synchronized with the back end. And if you use HTMX, it collapses all that into, there's just HTML sitting in the browser, and that's it.
Right.
And so there is a simplification there that makes the system, I think, less complicated in some ways. And the trade-off there is that depending on the interactivity needs that you have, it is going to be harder to achieve certain types of interactive experiences. And I think, again, Context Day was one of those sort of best case scenarios where they had some pretty competent back-end developers who were comfortable enough with front-end that they could, because when you use HTMX, you're going to be generating HTML on the back end. Like in the old days, if you're old like me. So if you're not comfortable with that, then that is going to be a learning experience. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're used to maybe the components model of React, and now you're dealing with templates, and just it's a very different way of doing things. And so I have seen people like dive into HTMX and be shocked that it's just such a different way of developing. So I would warn the listeners that that's probably coming if you've never done anything except React. It's a different way of building. The other thing, just as an aside, that I would say is don't try to also learn a new language. I've seen people do this where they're like, okay, I'm going to learn HTMX, and everyone says Go is cool, so I'm going to do HTMX and Go at the same time. In my mind, that's too much. Like,
too much,
if JavaScript, use a backend JavaScript framework. There's plenty of good ones that can produce HTML, like Astro or whatever. Don't try and bite off too much, because HTMX and the hypermedia approach that it uses is pretty dramatically different than what you're probably used to.
Yeah, like I would say, so I can speak a little bit to, I think, what you're talking about, right? Before React and JavaScript frameworks like Angular, even Vue, I would say like people were doing more templates inside larger frameworks like on the back end. So there was PHP, which is the biggest one. You got your WordPress, you got your Drupal sites, and then you've got Ruby on Rails, which was also like a template, like framework, but you were working mainly in Ruby. And then I think during that time, like people weren't thinking about like reactive interfacing websites. I think that probably only came around the time like jQuery was like doing it. And that used to be the thing. You would just sprinkle a bit of jQuery, but then like it became harder to create like a true like reactive app like experience using just jQuery and the jQuery UI framework. It was becoming hard to create like all these templates really quickly. So then people started experimenting all around, and you had things like Backbone JS that came out, and then there might have been Knockout, yeah, and then React was like another iteration where they perfected it. And I think after React, like it blew everything out of the water. But then you're right, in the last 5 years, I would say state management, I continue to hear this, is like the hardest problem, I think, for a lot of companies, especially when you start to scale up. And that's been my experience too, like working at different companies. In all those cases, state management have been like a big, right? And I think there's like an effort these days to streamline it, get it like more simplified. So this is where I feel like HTMX actually is a pretty good idea. And so I think you're right. If you have the experience of, that's the funniest thing, right? If you're an experienced developer, you probably have the experience if you've been around for at least like the last 10 years. If you're new, I feel like all this will just be like exactly Greek or something.
Yeah, it is hard. I did write a book. So there's a book called Hypermedia Systems, and the listeners or your people can check it out at hypermedia.systems, and it's available online for free. And I think it's worth reading through for particularly people who have never done sort of hypermedia-based development. And when I say hypermedia, I really mean HTML. Because in that book, like the first 3 chapters are basically me building a really simple contact application. And I use Python, which hopefully most people are familiar with. But I go through how the web works. Like, what is an HTTP request? What is it? Like, how does a form tag really work if it's just issuing a request the way it was designed to? And so I go through what are redirects and all the rest. Just all that historical knowledge that we as an industry have not done a great job of passing on. Here's how we do everything the React way now. That's cool. But here's this other way. This is how we used to build things. And just because it's the way we used to build things doesn't mean there are at least interesting ideas there, even if it was clunky. And then the next, I think 3 chapters or 4 chapters after that, I take that sort of web 1.0 style application that's built in the old style, and then I enhance it with HTMX and show how HTMX lets you overcome some of the UX limitations that the original web had, but still using that hypermedia idea. I really focus in on hypermedia as like the conceptual idea because I just like it. It's an interesting idea. So I would encourage any listeners, even if you just never write a line of HTMX, which is probably the statistically most likely thing for your listeners, to maybe just go and read it out of just interest and understanding how the web worked and where it came from.
We'll get a link up here afterwards, and we'll definitely put the book
And you
up.
don't have to buy it. I put it on LibGen too, so you can download it for free from there.
All good. I think that's great. I think there is definitely a demand for simplifying and making things easier to build and maintain. One thing that I've seen, going back to what we were talking about before, especially for this year, and it's just the way the industry is right now, but you're right, things could return or things are always like in constant cycle of up and down. But I think this year there's more of a push to do more with AI tools, do more with less headcount. It's just that, again, this is the way this industry is. Maybe it's always been like that, but it's just, I think I am curious this year to learn about what exactly is coming out. Like, again, you have AI, you have HTMX, you have different kinds of technologies. So I would ask you, like, what kind of technologies are you interested in right now, especially for
since I'm a professor, I'm less driven day to day by having AI is obviously just the big thing right now. And I feel a little bit silly because I remember when I was in grad school about 20 years ago, like making fun. Back then, you made fun of AI people because they
Yeah.
weren't really, they weren't achieving very much. And then suddenly it exploded on the scene, and now all those
Yeah.
people are laughing all the way to the bank. So shows what I know, and probably shows about how much you should listen to what I have to say about it. I do want to, one thing I can touch on is moving quickly. And there are some ways in which HTMX can help development teams move quickly, in that it's a simpler model. It collapses, it gets rid of that state on the client side. You only have the hypermedia sort of approach. You're a full stack developer, so you don't have this sort of gate where this negotiation point between your front end and your back end teams. Like one person is responsible for a feature, and that helps. But on the other hand, I do have to say React has such an incredible ecosystem around it that, just for example, ShadCN is one of these things where if you're in that world and you're just used to just grabbing a thing and slapping it in there and it looks nice and it works, HTMX doesn't have that. And I think what technology is going to help you move fastest going forward is really context sensitive, like extremely context sensitive, and how comfortable you are of like, am I okay with figuring something out that isn't like right there? Like the React ecosystem, again, everything is just right there for you. And that's the joy of being the de facto standard. So I do tell people, if you're looking for a job, do not learn HTMX. Learn React, because every job is going to ask for React, even if they don't need it.
Exactly. It's the most important. I think because you have such a huge ecosystem that is already established. So I think, and all the things that you mentioned, it's just like super easy to pick up a library. In fact, that was what we were talking about at the previous meetup. It's super easy to pick up a library, but then a lot of developers pick up so many libraries that are old or outdated, and then there's security holes and stuff like that. So you have to be careful with it.
And there's a lot of churn. Let's be honest. There's a lot of churn in the React world, and some people, maybe you call it innovation, right? HTMX isn't as churny, but maybe it's not as innovative. There's different adjectives we can use for these things. But I do think I would warn people who are trying to get a job. You're not putting HTMX on your resume is not going to help. So what I would say is, if you have a good position and maybe there's a spot for HTMX to simplify things, then maybe you try it out. Like I always recommend, try it on an internal tool that like sucks right now and see if it performs well. And then
that's the thing, right? That's always how it's been. I remember even back in like when I was working as a PHP developer, right before React was popular, it was jQuery, and I remember working on an app that was written in Angular. I was the one writing it, and everybody was like just saying, "Oh, wait, we don't need this right now. We just need to do it the PHP way." But I always look back and I think to myself that because I took the time to just like sit there and tinker with it and invest the time, that helped me. And eventually when Angular started really catching on, especially as it matured, that's when you saw the jobs really start to come for the Angular framework. And then my Angular knowledge helped me prepare for React. And I was like, okay, this is pretty simple. It's simpler than Angular actually. So I was ready to learn that. And I keep an eye now on Vue.js too. Like I've had some meetups on that, and we've tried out like writing like code to build simple apps and stuff like that together as a meetup. So I'm always paying attention. We've paid attention to ShadCN, and we look at a lot of the different frameworks out there that are easy for doing UI. So I think like the hardest part, I think, for people coming in now is which one do you pick? And I think ultimately you have to treat it the same way. Just going back to exactly what you're saying, you have to treat it the same way. Right now, like the industry prefers a certain a stack. Today it's React and JavaScript. But if you want to plan ahead, and this is how I think for our software engineers watching, you should be always like learning something else too, like on the side. Make sure you're strong first at the core thing that you have to get a job for, but then build side projects in different types of languages too.
Yeah, I would say, and what the funny, I say this, so I've said this a couple times now, like, I think it's also important to look back, like looking, because there's so much cool stuff in old technology that we don't even have anymore. Like when you go and you look at, just to pick an example, like Lisp machines in the early 80s, they were insane what they were doing with those things. Like they're way better in some ways than the environments that we have today. And you wouldn't know it unless you go back and you look at these old, another example I often give is the Visual Basic Debugger from like VB6, like in the late 90s. That debugger was better than any debugger I use today. I program mostly in Java and a little bit in Ruby and so forth. It was the best debugger I've ever used. And my understanding is that the VB.NET debugger has finally caught up with it, but there's so many things that were good about old technology that like if you just take them, and that's in some sense that's what HTMX is, even more this other project I work on called Hyperscript, where you just take old ideas. Like there's good stuff back there. It doesn't mean you have to do exactly that or go back to that. No one wants to go back to Web 1.0, but I often think that it's profitable to go back and look at these older ideas because they can trigger new and creative thoughts. Okay, how can we take that and adapt that idea and adapt it to the modern world?
Yeah. So I would be very interested if you have the time, obviously, in seeing a full presentation on HTMX or the group. Obviously, it comes back down to like calendars and dates, and we can get you scheduled. But I think like it would be really great to have you talk a lot about how HTMX works and how it's different. Maybe go through parts of what you might have already written in your book, just like on video, which would be great. And then we can also talk a little bit about like this concept too. I think this isn't really good. There's two things that you mentioned that are really good. One is old is still really important, and if you learn it, you get better context. And so maybe you could talk about how the web used to work and how like you're seeing bits of that today. And then the other thing that I think for 2025 and onward, I feel like everybody's using social media right now to build their businesses and stuff like that. I see it personally. I know that if you look back a decade ago, everybody was using a website. They were like, I'm going to build my own website. And like this past 5 years or whatever, I think people abandoned websites for social media building, which is unfortunate. So you have a lot of archaic websites still existing out there. But I think I think a lot of people are going to start going back to building websites, especially because like maybe a lot of different factors. I'm just going to throw it out there. There's probably like politics. And I think people want to explore what were we doing a decade ago? How can we take those good ideas and bring them in like the future? Because if we all just get behind like one social media empire or another, we're beholden to the kings, right, of that or the of that. Whereas if you have like your own thing, it's actually more interesting. You feel more of somebody who is like in the role of you're a developer. You're actually an architect as opposed to somebody who's just like making something like 1% like better for like a already established machine.
It's always like the internet's at this. I was there for the golden age of like blogs and RSS and the comments sections and like the forums and all that, and that was awesome. That was an
awesome time.
It wasn't awesome, and not only because I was younger and didn't hurt all the time, but I think it was genuinely cooler in many ways. There's just an unfortunate, I don't know what to say about it, but it seems like there's a natural monopoly, and a natural monopoly means that a market tends towards monopoly just because of the preferences rather than monopolist behavior. But there appears to be like at least an oligopoly of social media. People prefer to go where everyone is, and then everyone's there, and so everyone ends up there. So I'm very sympathetic because I liked that older way of doing things. And there's actually one of the core members on the HTMX team, Alex Petros, I know has been working. He hasn't really talked too much about it yet, but he's been working on on technologies like that. It's kind of the idea of the Fediverse. It has these ideas are knocking around out there, but no one's been able to really dynamite the great masses off of these big social media platforms. And I'm as guilty as anyone. my whole the whole reason anyone's ever heard of HTMX is probably because of my antics on Twitter.
Yeah, but it's again, it's infancy, and I think anytime something is in like infancy, there's just maybe all it needs is like a little bit of a spark for it to take off. And I think maybe if it's not HTMX, people are still thinking this way. Like just again, like we had Backbone and Knockout and we had Ember and all this different stuff. I feel like there may be sparks, and this might be like one of them to bring people back into the passion and the love for actual web development. Because I feel like people are going to want to like continue to build the creativity in people. A lot of people are going to want to like imagine or reimagine like these old ideas into like new, more powerful ideas. So that's me. That's my opinionated thing, right? That's Vijay's opinion, but I feel like this is a really good idea, the one HTMX. And in wrapping things up today too, because I know that we have to be cognizant of time, I would love to just have another talk with you specifically on HTMX and just really get us learning about things beyond just what we usually do. I feel like that, like, I think there's a lot of information about React and there's a lot of information about established frameworks and libraries, and we can still talk about those things, but I feel like it would be also great to start branching out and seeing what else is out there too.
Yeah, again, I would point to my book, the first couple chapters of my book, for people just to see if they don't know how the old web worked. That'll walk you through. Here's how it used to work, and that knowledge is pretty valuable. And I also say HTMX is pretty quick to learn. It's a different way of doing things, and so if you're used to like everything being in the place you're used to it being, then it can be very hard to pick up. But conceptually, there's not a bunch to it. It's a pretty small library. But yeah, I'm happy to come back on and talk about HTMX more specifically, maybe give just a presentation setting up a simple web app or something like that.
Very awesome. All right, so with that, we can conclude. And again, I think there's a lot that I got from today, and I'm glad to meet you. And I honestly feel like you also bring to the table like a lot of old school knowledge, which I think is missed. So,
what are you saying?
No,
what are you saying?
In terms of the book writing, like in terms of
what are you saying?
Okay,
it's all good. It's
all good. It's all good. Yeah, I have the same gray here too.
No, not quite as bad.
With that, I'm happy that you spoke with me today, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of what you have to talk about. So we'll be in touch.
Yeah, just shoot me an email. Happy to talk whenever. All right.
Thanks, Carson. Cool. I'll talk to you later.